Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Jason Corey, the Senior Director for Emerging Technologies at Red Hat. Jason, before break, we were talking a little bit about the three parts of open source. You talked about technology, you talked about development, and then organizational, and how agencies and organizations more broadly are starting to apply these concepts of open source to organizational structure, to this idea of Agile and DevSecOps. Take me to the next level down maybe and walk me through how that might work. What should agencies know about applying these concepts more broadly to non, if you will, quote unquote, technology areas?
Yeah, no, so I think the best way to describe it is in the planning phase. I think what we've seen is an evolution of clients really doing, 5-year, 6-year, like very long-term planning and doing, much shorter term planning. And I think that's a very simple thing for people to understand, right? When you look at how iterative development is done in an open source community, it's done very iteratively. So, really shrinking back and doing more shorter term planning is one element of that. Then I think that there are several practices that, seem very common that when I talk to a lot of non-technical audiences, like, they seem surprised by. So things like social contracts, right? That's a practice in Agile where the group working on something together comes up with, some norms and some, commitments they'll make to each other throughout the, collaborative process they're about to embark on. And, I think we're all familiar with like working groups and how, in the government, you seem to see them pop up a lot, right? Like, oh, we're going to do a working group on cloud or AI. But then every time there's a meeting, maybe they send a different representative from each department or each agency, right? So something in the social contract could be, hey, we're going to make a commitment to each other to like attend every meeting we can. And if we have to send a delegate, it's going to be rare, Something as simple as that can really build continuity, and you get a lot of progress out of doing that. So that's another practice that really comes from Agile or open source that's being applied. And then I think when you start to get a little more complex, people are starting to recognize if you want to do DevSecOps or DevOps, whatever term, you do have to create some form of a software factory. Like we've worked a lot with customers to build, we call it the trusted software supply chain. Like how can you develop software-based capabilities in a rapid fashion, but still have that integrity around security and ensure that you're even building the right product, right, for the use case. So I think those are the three things I would point to that we've really been observing. And there's countless agencies and really even a lot of our system integrator partners that are, because they're doing a lot of the app development today, right? So they're really building some of these software factories and trusted software supply chains with us for government customers.
There's been a big push for that trusted software factories. I know the Air Force is a big development shop around software. I know Social Security Administration. The other thing you said that really is interesting to me is the planning. And I spoke recently to someone in the community, and they said agencies and more broadly, I think any organization should no longer look at these 5-year plans, especially when it comes to IT modernization, and really take a full step back and say, what is working today based on the pandemic and the acceleration of digital transformation that's happened, and what isn't working, and how can we fix that in the next 3, 6, 9 months? Because it's those things that aren't working today that really need to work, because it became obvious during the pandemic. Do you get a sense that this approach to Agile, DevSecOps, this approach to kind of bringing more people together is starting to move agencies in that direction of that shorter term planning to say, what's our most immediate need that we need to fix because of whatever urgency is happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is a framework to do planning. And then part of it is prioritization, right? So I'm actually going to be meeting with some Army officials tomorrow. And, they're pretty open to say there's about 685 major programs in the Army, but there's their 31 plus 3 that really are the focal point for some of their modernization efforts. So I think, just going through the process of really figuring out where should you apply 80% of your time and resourcing is important. And then, I also think that when you get into this planning discussion, you really have to understand what the time horizon is and how you want to break something up. Because like most open source communities or even groups that really follow Agile principles, it's not like they're trying to do less. They're just breaking it apart in much smaller chunks. So, you get into the idea of, microservices are that, right? It's how do you take a large monolith application, but you build it incrementally and then provide reuse. So I think for us, you got to have kind of the front side done. Then you got to really figure out like what are the the milestones and the size of what you want to work on. And then the skills piece gets really important, right? Because you can have all the planning done, but if you don't have the resources to go actually execute it quickly, you run into issues. And I think the government's taken huge strides over the last 5 years, because that gets us very quickly into this whole acquisition discussion, right? Like how do you do things quickly when you have this acquisition framework and FARs that you have to follow. So I think that's really helped. And I think some of the success, like you pointed to Air Force and like some of the other groups doing this, like we've been involved in all those. And a lot of it comes because they're also bringing along the acquisition community, the security community, and it's a collaborative effort to do this faster.
When we talk about doing things faster, we got to then talk about the cloud. And I think that's an important piece to this discussion, because agencies can't have that 3 to 6 month time frame or 9 month time frame to improve digital transformation, improve digital services without at least some piece of the cloud. How does open source and cloud fit together? Walk me through, because I think a lot of people may say, well, if I'm on Azure, if I'm on AWS, if I'm using the IBM cloud, which I know you guys are probably big fans of, they say, well, that's not open source anymore. That's a specific proprietary cloud. Help me understand how the two fit together.
Yeah, so I think, again, there's different layers to this. Like a good thing to point out to the listeners and viewers is that most clouds are built on a lot of open source technologies, right? Because when you get into things like the economics of it and the performance of what cloud providers need at that hyperscale, like open source has been the engine to kind of do that. I think the way Red Hat's viewed it, and the more I talk to clients, I think they agree with this strategy as well, is like cloud is not just about like public cloud, which is, immediately our minds probably go to, like you said, the AWSs, the Amazons of the world. You can absolutely build a private cloud, and we've got a lot of examples of working with customers to do that. Sometimes it's a security reason, sometimes it's a cost reason, and then they're absolutely going to. So I think for most executives I talk to, there's kind of this choice, right? They're balancing. It's like, well, I can go all in with a cloud provider, or maybe 2 cloud providers, or I could potentially build, a private cloud-like capability. And I think the reality they're coming to is that, yeah, if you're doing an analytics project, maybe you're going to use Google Cloud, right? And if you are going to do, Office 365, you're obviously going to have some stuff going on with Microsoft. But there's a whole, large group of applications and data that, are going to be on premise for a long time. So they need this hybrid capability, and that's, been our strategy for, probably at least the last 9 years. So, everyone knows Red Hat for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and it was a great operating system to allow customers to have choice for their x86 hardware, right? If you wanted to run Dell or HP or IBM, whatever, as long as you were running OpenShift, you could kind of pick your own hardware platform. OpenShift, which is our container-based Kubernetes offering, is kind of that for clouds, right? So you can run that on different cloud providers. And if you have that level of abstraction, you can move workloads around to different things. And it gets back again to that skills piece, right? Is if you have a common understanding of how to administer and even develop applications in OpenShift, no matter what cloud you're in, your own cloud or a public cloud provider, you'll have that same kind of experience. So I think that's been our observation. Different clients will call it like operating system of the cloud, but that's what it's about, right? It's about creating separation between a piece of hardware you might have bought in 1990, and then now, the new hardware, which is a cloud provider of some kind.
You mentioned containers, you mentioned Kubernetes. Let's talk about application modernization, because I think that's the other piece that's going on here. It's one thing to say we're going to move to the cloud, but it's really all about what are you doing in the cloud, and how do you take that legacy app, that outdated application, and modernize it in some way. What are you starting to see from your clients around application modernization? That's, to me, really where the rubber hits the road when it comes to modernization.
Yeah. I think, the first thing when it comes to modernization is really helping clients determine, is this something you can evolve, or do you need to start from scratch? And, I think most government customers immediately think like they can start to modernize something. But sometimes it does make sense, right, to capture the data, present that data to a new application that you build. So I think that's the first question, is like, do you modernize or build new? The other thing I think that we see is most of the modernizations will obviously involve cloud, right? Whether it's public or private. And I think people have gravitated towards containers of some kind because of the portability aspect of it, but then also the density aspect of it. If you think back to kind of the 90s, right, when people really were starting to get into virtualization, the ability to run multiple applications on a single piece of hardware was significant. And now when you look at what the density levels you can get with containers are, that's a benefit too. And I think that really dials us back to like, why do cloud providers, use things like Kubernetes? Why did Google invent, Borg, which eventually evolved to Kubernetes? So, I think the decisions up front are important. Definitely container-based technologies. I think across the board, whether it's the vendor communities or the open source communities, Kubernetes is one, right? Like we were really early in on the Kubernetes and Docker kind of shift. And that's because we were so involved in the open source communities. Like we saw the trends that were happening there, 5-6 years ago, and really kind of invested in that area. So I think, that's kind of how I view app modernization. We've been working with a lot of integrators. We just finished a 2-year modernization of a really large SEC application, which I think we're going to talk about during our government symposium in November. So come listen about that, because a lot of it's about breaking these monoliths into those microservices that I mentioned, and that provides a lot of flexibility. It's a very natural fit for things like containers, and but it does present some challenges, right? Like you got to be able to monitor 1,000 different microservices versus, one monolith. So hopefully that answers the question for you, Jason.
It does. It helps, and I look forward to hearing more about the case study, because those tend to be the really where you see some good progress. Jason, we're almost out of time. Before I let you go, what's the one or two things as agencies continue down this path, these short-term goals they should keep in mind about whether it's open source or cloud or application modernization? What's their one big takeaway from our discussion today?
Yeah, I would say, as you've heard during this discussion, open source is a large portion of this, whether it's the technology, the development model, or even the organizational construct. And, Red Hat's been in this space for over 25 years. I think what I always advise clients is, you don't have to work with Red Hat, but you have to have a trusted partner that really understands all those dynamics. And when you think about open source and even cloud, you got to think about exit costs. Like, what would happen if, God forbid, your cloud provider increased costs by X, or what would happen if Red Hat did something? Because we spend a lot of time on that. Then you got to look at things like code contribution. Like, how much code contribution does your vendor have in these open source communities? How many customers do they have actually running this? And that's really when we look at measurement of Red Hat as a company. We look at customer outcomes, customers by different technology areas. But most importantly, it's about our contributions and, what are we putting back upstream into the communities that can do good things.
All right, good advice. A lot to consider here. Unfortunately, though, we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Jason Corey is the Senior Director for Emerging Technologies at Red Hat. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Stay well.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.